The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of chatter, as if the very walls themselves could sense that something unusual was about to unfold. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall arched windows, scattering warm golden beams across the polished wooden benches. Dust motes danced in the air, shimmering like tiny flecks of truth waiting to be uncovered. At the front of the room sat Judge Malcolm Harrington, a man known not just for his sharp tongue but for the way he wielded his authority like a sword. His gavel rested firmly in his hand, ready to silence anything or anyone that dared to disrupt his stage. For that was how he saw the courtroom, a theater in which he was the undisputed star. On the benches sat attorneys in crisp suits, paralegals balancing files on their laps, and nervous defendants waiting for their names to be called. And then, near the back, sat a woman who didn't belong, at least not in the eyes of those around her. She wore a simple blue dress, the kind you might buy from a department store clearance rack. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and she carried no fancy briefcase, only a worn leather bag that had clearly seen better days. She looked ordinary, forgettable even, but her eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, missed nothing. When the bailiff called the next case, a man in his late 40s shuffled nervously to the front. He was accused of a serious financial fraud, and his public defender had failed to show up. Judge Harrington rolled his eyes dramatically, leaning back in his chair as if the mere existence of the defendant wasted his precious time. "This is what I'm dealing with today?" the judge muttered loud enough for the courtroom to hear. A few attorneys snickered. The man stammered, "Your Honor, I don't know what to do without my lawyer." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before breaking the law," Harrington snapped, slamming his gavel lightly. "This court doesn't have time for excuses." The defendant's shoulders slumped. The room seemed to close in on him, every eye watching with silent judgment. And that was when the woman in the blue dress stood up. All heads turned as she stepped forward, her simple shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. She didn't walk like someone timid. She walked like someone who belonged even though no one recognized her. "Your Honor," she said clearly, her voice calm but commanding. "If this man has no representation, I'd be willing to assist." The judge burst into laughter. Actual full-bellied laughter. The kind of cruel, dismissive laugh meant to belittle. "You," Harrington said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What are you supposed to be? A good Samaritan off the street? Do you even know what a cross-examination is?" The courtroom joined in his laughter, some out of fear, others out of habit. But the woman didn't flinch. She stood taller, her eyes locked on the judge's with an intensity that silenced the giggles around her. "My name isn't important right now," she replied steadily. "What is important is that this man has the right to fair representation, and if no one else will give it to him, I will." The judge smirked, clearly entertained. "This is ridiculous. Do you have a law degree hidden in that little handbag of yours?" For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Sometimes," she said softly. "You don't need to announce what you know. You just have to show it." The judge leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. He loved humiliating people who thought they could outsmart him. And this woman had practically delivered herself on a silver platter. "Fine," he said with mock grandeur, waving his hand as though granting her a stage. "If you think you can play lawyer, then go ahead. Impress us all, but don't expect me to go easy on you when you fail." The woman nodded once, calm as the surface of a still lake. She approached the defendant, who looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Don't worry," she whispered so only he could hear. "I know exactly what I'm doing." The man blinked. Something in her tone, unshakable, confident, gave him a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. The trial began, and as the prosecution launched into their argument, the woman listened quietly, taking notes in a small, battered notebook. She didn't interrupt, didn't fidget, didn't show a hint of nervousness. She simply observed, as though every word spoken was a piece of a puzzle she was already solving in her mind. The judge, meanwhile, kept stealing glances at her. He expected her to crumble, to lose her composure, to reveal that she was nothing more than a foolish intruder. But she didn't. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with the kind of composure that seasoned attorneys take years to perfect. Her voice was clear, measured, persuasive. She poked holes in the prosecution's claims with surgical precision, each question she asked cutting deeper into the weaknesses of their case. The room grew silent. The snickers vanished. Even the judge's smug grin began to fade, replaced by something he rarely felt: unease. Because for the first time in his career, Judge Harrington realized he might have underestimated someone, and he hated it. The courtroom, once buzzing with laughter and smugness, now sat in stunned silence. Every word the woman had spoken hung in the air like an echo of something powerful, undeniable, and deeply unsettling for those who had dismissed her. Even Judge Harrington, a man whose pride often blinded him, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Who was this woman? The prosecutors exchanged uneasy glances. They had entered the courtroom expecting a simple victory, a routine conviction where the defendant's lack of proper counsel would make their work effortless. But now, with this mysterious stranger dissecting their arguments piece by piece, the case felt shaky. It wasn't just the way she argued. It was the way she saw. Her eyes weren't just scanning notes. They were analyzing, deconstructing, predicting every move before it happened. Whispers began spreading among the spectators. Where did she come from? She's not listed as counsel on the case. She speaks like she's done this before. Maybe she's one of those activist types, trying to make a scene. But those who knew the law, real attorneys seated in the gallery, felt something else entirely: dread. They recognized in her words a precision that didn't come from guesswork. No, this was the work of someone trained, deeply trained in the art of law. The judge cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. His gavel tapped against the desk, a weak attempt at restoring authority. "Order in the court," he barked. "We are not here to entertain theatrics from unqualified participants." The woman turned her gaze toward him, calm but piercing. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the Constitution guarantees this man the right to legal representation. If the state has failed to provide it, someone must step in. You may doubt me, but you cannot deny his rights." Her words struck like thunder. The judge's jaw clenched. He despised being challenged, especially by someone who looked so plain, so beneath him. Yet a small part of him knew she was correct. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "Very well," he sneered. "Since you're so eager to embarrass yourself, proceed. But let it be known, when you fall short, this court will not protect you." The woman gave a faint smile, one that unsettled Harrington further. "I don't need protection," she said softly. "Truth will protect me." The prosecution resumed, trying to rebuild their case, but their confidence was gone. Each time they presented evidence, the woman countered with logic so airtight, it left them fumbling for words. She questioned the credibility of their witnesses, pointed out inconsistencies in their documentation, and highlighted every procedural error they had made. By the time she was finished, the once assured prosecutors looked as though they had run a marathon. Exhausted, sweaty, and utterly defeated, the defendant, still wide-eyed, whispered, "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she simply placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her silence more comforting than any words. Meanwhile, in the gallery, attorneys whispered with increasing intensity, "She's brilliant. This isn't some random woman. She knows case law like the back of her hand. Could she be a barred attorney?" And then one older lawyer leaned closer to his colleague, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, she's more than that. She's not just trained, she's seasoned. Whoever she is, she's been in more courtrooms than Harrington himself." The rumor spread like wildfire. Eyes darted back and forth, the tension mounting with each passing second. Judge Harrington noticed the shift, the way the room was no longer mocking her but revering her. And it infuriated him. This was his court, his domain. No stranger, no matter how sharp, was going to upstage him. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with venom. "Enough games. You speak well, I'll give you that. But anyone can memorize a few lines and repeat them. What I want to know is simple. Who are you? What credentials give you the right to stand in my courtroom and pretend you belong?" The woman's eyes locked on his. For the first time, her expression hardened. The playful glint vanished, replaced by something colder, something dangerous. "Pretend?" She repeated, her voice low but powerful. "Your Honor, I don't pretend, I know. And soon so will you," the room gasped. The words weren't shouted, but they cut deeper than any scream could have. Harrington's face flushed crimson, partly from rage, partly from the realization that he had lost control of his court. But before he could respond, the bailiff approached him, whispering something urgently in his ear. Harrington's expression faltered. His eyes flickered toward the woman, then back at the bailiff. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's impossible." The bailiff nodded grimly. "It's her, sir." I checked. The judge's chest tightened. Suddenly everything made sense. The composure, the precision, the way she dismantled arguments like a master craftsman. This was no ordinary woman. She wasn't a bystander. She was someone far more dangerous to his pride, and yet the judge couldn't expose her. Not yet. To admit who she really was would be to admit that he had mocked her unjustly, that he had belittled someone far above his station. So instead, he doubled down, hoping to find a crack in her armor before the truth spilled out. "Very well," he said loudly, masking his unease with arrogance. "If you insist on continuing this charade, then I'll indulge you. But understand this. When the mask falls, you'll be remembered not for your boldness but for your humiliation." The woman tilted her head slightly, almost pitying him. "Sometimes, Your Honor, humiliation comes to those who least expect it." The trial continued, and with every passing minute it became more obvious. She wasn't just good. She was extraordinary. Her arguments weren't just sound, they were devastating. The prosecution stumbled more with each exchange, and even the jury began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the tide turning. By the end of the day, the defendant, once hopeless, now stood with a spark of confidence. The woman had built for him not just a defense but a fortress. As court adjourned, Harrington slammed his gavel harder than usual, his face tight with frustration. "We reconvene tomorrow," he barked, his voice cracking ever so slightly. The woman gathered her notes, calm as ever, and began to walk out. But as she passed the judge's bench, she paused, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You wanted to know who I am," she said softly. "Soon you won't have to ask." Harrington froze, his knuckles white as they gripped the gavel. For the first time in years, Judge Malcolm Harrington felt something he thought himself immune to: fear. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall courtroom windows, painting golden streaks across the polished wood floor. The air was tense, almost electric, as the courtroom filled again. Attorneys whispered to each other, jurors shifted nervously, and even the court reporters seemed to pause mid-keystroke, as if anticipating the moment the mysterious woman would return. Judge Harrington entered last, his expression a mixture of pride, annoyance, and an unacknowledged dread. He tried to maintain his usual commanding presence, but deep down he knew yesterday's courtroom performance had cracked the facade of his authority. He had mocked her, laughed at her, and yet, despite every effort to diminish her, she had prevailed. And now, the thought that she might not be who she appeared to be gnawed at him relentlessly. The woman entered quietly, her blue dress modest but impeccable, her leather bag swinging slightly at her side. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her immediately. The hushed murmurs confirmed what everyone already suspected. She was no ordinary woman. Some spectators clutched their notebooks, scribbling furiously. Others simply stared, their mouths slightly agape. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the same calm, purposeful stride she had shown the day before. When she stood before the judge, she met his gaze squarely, unflinching. There was no pretense now, only quiet, unyielding authority. Judge Harrington tried to regain control of the room with a forceful gavel tap, but the sound felt hollow. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice sharper than usual. "And I expect no nonsense this time?" The woman nodded once, acknowledging his words without intimidation or deference. She turned her attention to the defendant, who stood as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "Good morning," she said, her tone gentle but precise. "We have an opportunity today to correct some mistakes, to ensure that justice isn't just a word, but a reality. Are you ready?" The defendant swallowed hard but nodded. There was no fear in her presence, only clarity, a reassurance he hadn't felt in weeks. As the prosecution began their arguments again, she listened intently, pen poised over her notebook. Every word, every gesture, every slight inflection was catalogued and analyzed. She didn't merely react. She anticipated. Every weak point in the prosecution's case was highlighted, every inconsistency catalogued, and every potential line of questioning prepared in advance. When her turn came, she rose to speak with a confidence that silenced the courtroom before she uttered a single word. "Your Honor," she began, "before we proceed, I must address the procedural discrepancies observed yesterday." The judge, momentarily caught off guard, raised a brow. Procedural discrepancies? Explain. She stepped forward, her voice smooth, commanding yet calm. Firstly, several pieces of evidence submitted by the prosecution were not properly notarized. Secondly, witness testimonies were inconsistent and in several cases directly contradictory. Lastly, the defendant was denied access to legal representation for an extended period, which, as per the Sixth Amendment, is a violation of his constitutional rights. Murmurs swept through the courtroom. The legal experts in the gallery exchanged glances. Some were visibly impressed while others leaned forward, trying to catch every word. Even the jury, who had started the day skeptical, sat straight, her eyes wide. Judge Harrington's jaw tightened. He had expected competence, perhaps even skill, but what he did not expect was precision, depth, and mastery. Every word she spoke carried authority beyond her apparent age or attire. "And how?" he asked, trying to mask his awe with sarcasm. "Does a humble woman, wandering unlisted into my courtroom, know so much about law?" She paused, just a heartbeat, enough to make him feel the weight of her gaze. Then she said softly but deliberately, "Sometimes, Your Honor, the most effective lessons are learned not in lecture halls but in battlefields. I have fought in many courtrooms, many cases, many battles. Today I am here not to prove myself to you but to ensure justice is done." The room went silent again. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a fraction of a second. As the trial proceeded, the prosecution tried to regain their footing, but every question they raised was countered before it was fully formed. Every argument was anticipated, deflected or dismantled entirely. It was as if she had rehearsed every possible scenario, every strategy, every potential trap. By mid-morning, Judge Harrington found himself leaning forward on the bench, his knuckles white, his mind racing. How could this be possible? He had faced countless attorneys over decades, yet none had commanded a courtroom the way she did. None had dismantled the prosecution so efficiently. None had done it with such grace, such poise, such brilliance. And then it happened. A witness, previously considered a key asset for the prosecution, was called to testify. As he spoke, the woman noticed a subtle hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty. With a single measured question, she exposed a contradiction in his testimony, unraveling the foundation of the prosecution's argument. The jury leaned in, captivated, while the prosecutors exchanged frantic whispers, trying to salvage the situation. Judge Harrington's face turned a shade redder, part from anger, part from realization. She wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. After the witness left the stand, she approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "with your permission, I would like to call into question the credibility of several pieces of evidence that have been presented. Upon review, it is clear that these items have been mishandled, compromising the integrity of this trial." The judge opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He felt trapped, a prisoner of circumstance. If he denied her request, it would appear unjust. If he allowed it, the prosecution's case would crumble further. For the first time, he realized that his courtroom, his rules, his authority, all of it was being subtly challenged by someone who, on the surface, seemed utterly ordinary. The session continued, each moment building tension, each argument raising stakes. The woman worked meticulously, guiding the defendant through questions, protecting him from missteps, and exposing weaknesses in the opposing side. By the afternoon, the prosecution's confidence had eroded completely, replaced with desperation and panic. Outside the courtroom, whispers of the woman's skill had begun to spread. Lawyers from other cases were already speculating, trying to identify her. Some were certain she was a prodigy, a hidden genius who had somehow slipped through the cracks of public recognition. Others believed she might be a former judge or a renowned attorney working incognito. Judge Harrington, meanwhile, was left to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had underestimated her, mocked her, and assumed she was powerless. And yet, with each passing hour, her brilliance became more undeniable. Finally, as the court adjourned for the day, she gathered her notes and prepared to leave. She walked past the judge's bench slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was no malice, no arrogance, only calm assurance. "You wanted to know who I am," she said softly. "And soon you will." Harrington's hand tightened around his gavel. He didn't yet know how she had the skill, the knowledge or the authority she clearly possessed. But he knew one thing. When the mask fully came off, it would change everything, not just this case, but the entire perception of him in the courtroom. The defendant looked at her with renewed hope, realizing that the woman he had once thought a simple volunteer was, in reality, a force to be reckoned with. And the judge, though unwilling to admit it, felt the first stirrings of genuine respect, laced, of course, with fear. The stage was set for the next day. The mask was beginning to slip. The truth about her identity was on the horizon, and when it emerged fully, no one would be able to ignore it. The following morning, sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, illuminating the courtroom with an almost theatrical glow. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if the room itself knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. Word of the mysterious woman had spread beyond the immediate courthouse. Murmurs among attorneys, clerks, and even members of the press suggested that today's proceedings would be unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. Judge Harrington entered first, his usual imposing presence slightly frayed at the edges. He had spent a sleepless night replaying yesterday's events over and over in his mind. How had he allowed a stranger, someone so seemingly unremarkable, to dismantle the prosecution so thoroughly? Pride and irritation warred with an uncomfortable, begrudging respect. The woman had shown skill, confidence, and authority that rivaled even the most experienced attorneys he had encountered. And now he could no longer ignore the nagging thought, who was she really? The courtroom slowly filled. Jurors, intrigued and curious, whispered among themselves. Court staff tried to maintain order, but every glance toward the front of the room betrayed their anticipation. The prosecution, looking disheveled and uneasy, fidgeted with papers, clearly unsettled by what awaited them. The gallery, crowded with spectators and legal observers, had grown even more attentive, many straining to catch a glimpse of the woman. Then she entered. The room went still. Her posture was upright, calm, and commanding, as if she were the natural master of the courtroom rather than an outsider who had wandered in by chance. Her blue dress seemed almost symbolic now, simple, modest, yet concealing an intelligence and authority far beyond appearances. Judge Harrington's jaw tightened. He watched her approach, noting the calm precision of her movements, the confidence in her every step. "Let's proceed," he said, though his voice carried a tension it had not carried before. The woman did not respond verbally. Instead, she placed her notes carefully on the defendant's table and addressed the court with a voice that was calm, measured, yet impossible to ignore. "Before we begin, Your Honor, there is an important matter regarding the credibility and background of all parties involved that must be addressed. Transparency is essential to justice." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his directly. "I have, over the course of my career, represented clients in some of the most complex, high-stakes cases in the state. My identity has been intentionally obscured in this instance to ensure impartiality and to allow me to focus solely on the pursuit of justice for this client." A hush fell over the courtroom. The gallery gasped, some spectators leaning forward in disbelief. Even the prosecution froze mid-note, their expressions betraying shock. The judge, however, felt a storm of emotion swirl inside him. Astonishment, indignation, and an unwelcome thrill of awe. You are a licensed attorney?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. More than that, I am a trial attorney with over a decade of experience in both civil and criminal law. I have successfully argued cases at state and federal levels, and I have trained countless young lawyers in courtroom strategy and procedure. My appearance here is a choice, not a mistake. I am here because this defendant's rights deserve to be upheld no matter who doubts my capabilities." The courtroom erupted with whispers and murmurs. Jurors exchanged stunned glances. Some of the prosecution's assistants whispered urgently among themselves, clearly reassessing every assumption they had held about the case. Even the bailiff's hand tightened on the railing, unsure whether to intervene or simply stand in awe. Judge Harrington, for a rare moment, found himself without words. Pride warred with recognition. Indignation clashed with respect. How could he have so casually dismissed her? How could he have laughed at someone whose mastery of the law surpassed most of the attorneys he had encountered in decades on the bench? She continued, her tone calm yet sharp. "Your Honor, I am revealing my credentials not to challenge your authority, but to ensure that this trial proceeds with the highest regard for justice." The defendant has been without proper legal counsel, and that must be rectified immediately. Every witness, every piece of evidence, and every statement must be examined in light of proper legal standards. Only then can we ensure a fair outcome. A ripple of excitement spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. The gallery murmured with astonishment. The prosecution's lead attorney looked pale, sweat glistening on his brow. He had spent weeks preparing this case, assuming every outcome would follow a predictable pattern, and now, with the revelation of her true identity, the entire foundation of his strategy seemed precarious. The defendant, still wide-eyed, whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "I can't believe this." "She's incredible." The woman offered a reassuring glance. "Focus on what matters now," she said softly. "The past is irrelevant. The present is our opportunity." Judge Harrington, finally regaining some semblance of composure, leaned forward. "Very well," he said, his voice deliberate. "If you are indeed a licensed attorney and you have the experience you claim, then you may continue with the defense. But understand this, I will be watching closely. Any misstep, any error, and I will not hesitate to intervene." She inclined her head slightly. "Understood, Your Honor. Justice is my only interest here, not spectacle." The trial resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The courtroom that had once laughed and mocked her was now tense with anticipation. Every move she made was scrutinized. Every word she spoke carried authority and weight. Witnesses faltered under her questioning, their carefully rehearsed statements unraveling as she methodically exposed contradictions, weaknesses, and inconsistencies. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that the prosecution's case was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. Evidence that had seemed ironclad the day before now appeared shaky under her scrutiny. Witnesses who had seemed confident and credible were forced to admit gaps and uncertainties. The jury leaned forward, captivated, their attention fixed entirely on her. Judge Harrington, watching it all unfold, felt a strange mixture of humiliation and admiration. He had underestimated her, mocked her, and assumed her simple appearance was a reflection of her capability. He realized now how wrong he had been, and how foolish. Yet, despite his personal discomfort, he could not deny the truth. The courtroom had been transformed by her presence. What had begun as a simple defense for a defendant had evolved into a masterclass in law, strategy, and intellectual precision. As the day drew to a close, the woman gathered her notes and prepared to leave. She paused at the judge's bench, her gaze meeting his once more. "Now you know who I am," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "And tomorrow we will conclude this trial. Justice will be served and no assumptions, appearances, or arrogance will stand in the way." Judge Harrington remained silent, his mind racing. Pride, stubbornness, and ego warred with the undeniable respect he felt for her abilities. He had learned a lesson that could not be unlearned. Appearances are deceptive, and brilliance often hides behind the most unassuming masks. The courtroom emptied slowly, each person carrying with them the awareness that they had witnessed something remarkable. Outside, reporters and onlookers whispered furiously, speculating about the mysterious attorney who had shattered expectations, outwitted the prosecution, and forced a veteran judge to confront his own biases. And somewhere deep inside Judge Harrington, a seed of humility had been planted, a rare, uncomfortable, yet transformative realization that the pursuit of justice often comes from the most unexpected sources. Tomorrow would be the final day of the trial. The truth about her brilliance was fully revealed, but the outcome still hung in the balance. And when it was over, no one in that courtroom or beyond would ever forget the woman who had walked in as a humble stranger and left as an undeniable force of justice. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning, as if the very air sensed that the events about to unfold would be extraordinary. Every eye was fixed on the woman who had transformed a routine case into a spectacle of skill, precision, and revelation. Reporters, spectators, attorneys, and jurors alike waited holding their breath, anticipating the final act in a performance none would soon forget. Judge Harrington entered first, his robe settling heavily on his shoulders, his expression a carefully maintained mask of authority. Yet beneath the surface he was restless. He had spent a sleepless night reviewing every detail, replaying the moments of the past 2 days, questioning himself and his own judgments. How had he allowed someone so unassuming to outmaneuver him and the prosecution? And yet, despite his pride, he could not deny the truth. The woman before him was nothing short of extraordinary. The defendant appeared calmer today, his shoulders squared, his eyes shining with a cautious optimism that had been absent just days before. The presence of the woman had instilled in him a sense of hope, a conviction that justice was possible even against overwhelming odds. The woman herself entered with her usual quiet confidence, her modest attire belying the formidable intellect and skill she possessed. Her steps were measured, deliberate, and every movement conveyed the certainty of someone who had already won the battle in her mind. She paused briefly at the front of the courtroom, scanning the assembled faces. Jury, prosecution, spectators, and finally, Judge Harrington. Her eyes were calm but penetrating, a subtle reminder that appearances could be deceiving. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said softly, yet firmly. "Today we bring this trial to its conclusion. My goal remains the same, to ensure justice is served fairly, impartially, and in accordance with the law." Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly, attempting to regain the sense of control he had always prided himself on. "Proceed," he commanded. "But let it be known, any misstep will not be tolerated." She nodded once, her expression serene. "Understood." The prosecution rose, visibly tense, their confidence eroded by the past 2 days of relentless scrutiny. Every argument they had prepared seemed fragile, every strategy already anticipated and countered. They began their final summation, attempting to salvage credibility, but it was clear they were fighting a battle already lost. When her turn came, she rose with poise, her movements deliberate, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, members of the jury, I will not waste your time with theatrics or empty rhetoric. What we have witnessed over the course of this trial is not simply a series of arguments, but a demonstration of how justice must operate when fairness, scrutiny, and careful analysis are applied. The evidence presented by the prosecution contains gaps, inconsistencies, and errors. The testimony, while sincere in parts, is undermined by contradictions. And most importantly, the defendant's rights, which are protected by our Constitution, were compromised until proper representation was ensured." She paused, letting her words sink into the courtroom. The jury leaned forward, captivated by her clarity and precision. Every syllable carried weight, every sentence constructed with the deliberate craftsmanship of someone who had mastered the art of persuasion over years of experience. In examining this case, we must ask ourselves, can we rely on evidence that is flawed, testimonies that contradict each other, and procedures that have not been correctly followed? The answer, Your Honor, is no. Justice cannot be served through assumptions, shortcuts, or negligence. It requires diligence, attention, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, landing on the judge for a brief moment. This trial is not about appearances or initial impressions. It is about facts, law, and integrity, and when these elements are honored, the outcome is clear. The room was silent, as though every person present felt the weight of her authority. The prosecution's lead attorney, sweating and pale, exchanged panicked glances with his team. They had been confident, sure of their victory, and now their case crumbled under scrutiny. Every objection, every attempted rebuttal was deftly countered. The woman's precision and foresight had rendered them powerless. Judge Harrington, for the first time, felt the limits of his own authority. He had mocked her, belittled her, and assumed she was nothing more than a simple interloper. And yet she had exposed the flaws in his courtroom, his assumptions, and the very system he had once believed he controlled. Pride warred with undeniable respect, and he found himself strangely humbled. The woman continued, her voice unwavering. "Members of the jury, the role of a juror is not to be swayed by appearances, but to weigh evidence carefully, to consider testimony critically, and to uphold justice without bias. Today, you have seen firsthand how flaws in evidence and procedure can mislead even the most experienced legal minds. I urge you to examine the facts, disregard any superficial impressions, and render a verdict that reflects truth, fairness, and the principles upon which our legal system stands." As she concluded, the courtroom remained suspended in a rare, profound silence. The jury absorbed her words with the gravity they deserved. Every member understood that this was not just a trial. It was a lesson in integrity, diligence, and the power of intellect unencumbered by assumptions about appearance or demeanor. The prosecution, defeated and exhausted, sat down in resignation. Even the most confident among them knew that their arguments had been dismantled with a skill that was beyond ordinary comprehension. They had faced many talented attorneys before, but none like this. None who combined intellect, strategy, and clarity in such a seamless, commanding way. Judge Harrington finally spoke, his voice measured, slightly hoarse with emotion he did not care to admit. The jury will now deliberate. The courtroom emptied, leaving only the essential participants. The jury, the judge, the defendant, and the woman. The defendant turned to her, awe and gratitude evident in his eyes. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. She smiled gently, almost warmly, and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "No thanks are necessary. Justice, not gratitude, is our goal." Hours passed as the jury deliberated. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread like wildfire. Reporters speculated about her identity, the brilliance she had demonstrated, and the unprecedented way she had turned the trial on its head. People debated how someone who had appeared so simple could possess such mastery, such insight, and such command over the legal system. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Harrington called them to the stand. The foreperson cleared their throat and in a voice steady but solemn announced the verdict. Not guilty. A wave of astonishment swept through the courtroom. The defendant, tears welling in his eyes, could scarcely believe it. He turned to the woman, who simply nodded, calm and composed. Justice had been served, and it had been done impeccably. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. And yet, in the quiet of his mind, he acknowledged a truth he could not speak aloud. She had bested him, the prosecution, and the entire courtroom, all while concealing her true identity. His assumptions, his pride, and his prejudices had been confronted and shattered by someone who had walked in looking ordinary but was, in truth, extraordinary. As the courtroom emptied, she paused at the judge's bench, her eyes meeting his one final time. "Justice is not about appearances, Your Honor," she said softly. "It is about knowledge, diligence, and integrity. Remember that." He watched her leave, a quiet respect settling over him. In the weeks and months that followed, the case became a landmark example cited in law schools, legal journals, and judicial reviews. It was not merely a story of a defendant's vindication, but a story of brilliance, humility, and the power of intellect hidden behind the most unassuming facades. Judge Harrington, having learned a lesson that would remain with him for the rest of his career, often reflected on those 2 days in court. He had mocked her, doubted her, and underestimated her, and yet in doing so, he had witnessed a masterclass in law and justice, delivered by a woman who, by all appearances, had seemed ordinary, but whose mind was nothing short of genius. The defendant went on to rebuild his life, carrying with him the profound gratitude for the woman who had defended him so fiercely and brilliantly. The courtroom staff, attorneys, and jurors carried the lesson as well. Brilliance often hides behind simplicity, and true justice requires courage, insight, and an unwavering commitment to what is right. And as for the woman herself, she vanished quietly after the trial, leaving behind only the memory of her extraordinary skill, the revelation of her identity, and the indelible mark she had left on everyone present. The courtroom had been transformed. Judge Harrington had been humbled, and the world, at least for those who witnessed it firsthand, had been reminded that genius is not always loud or ostentatious. It often arrives quietly, wearing the guise of simplicity, and changes everything it touches.